Hi there and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank. Today we're going to speak with Paul Kendrick, the author of 9 Days, The Race to Save Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life and Win the 1960 Election. This is the third book that he and his father have written together. He's worked in the Obama White House, runs the political organizing group Rust Belt Rising, and is an adjunct professor at National Louis University. Paul, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Really excited to talk to you about 9 Days. Thank you for all you do to spread history.
It's my pleasure. It's a ton of fun. Before we do start, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. On October 16th, 1960, Martin Luther King joined 50 student activists for a sit-in at a department store in downtown Atlanta. He was one of many arrested after he refused to leave private property. Since he was on probation for a previous driving offense, he was sentenced to hard labor for 4 months in state prison. Also, on that day, the presidential race was in its waning moments. Kennedy and Nixon were racing across the country, trying to piece together 270 electoral votes. And each were wondering how to get the votes of African Americans without offending various groups of white voters. My first question, Paul, is when it comes to October surprises, we all hear about October surprises every 4th November, the late-breaking news stories that can tip a presidential election. Where does the arrest of Martin Luther King Jr. on October 19th, 1960 rank?
I put it at the top because it ends up totally reshaping our political parties in this late shift of black voters. There's not much like that we've had some really critical ones that have moved things at the margins, which make a difference in a close election. But this really reshaped our politics for decades to come in ways that are still with us in terms of who our parties appeal to and who makes up our political coalition. So the end of an election is a high stakes, dramatic, exciting thing. And so in finding this story, we wanted to take the reader into the feel of those last days where the fast decisions that leaders make end up changing our history, give us the history we have today. And so for Dr. King to be arrested, that was an October surprise that neither Kennedy or Nixon really wanted because they were kind of avoiding the issue of race. And Atlanta black college students of the sit-in movement who pressured King to go to jail with them really forced their issue to be discussed, and in that sense challenged which presidential candidate would have the courage to speak up for King. And in 9 Days, we tell the story of how, because of a trio of civil rights staffers on this campaign that intervened before they ever had permission to, that ends up happening.
Before we get too far in, I do want to explain, I want to have you explain who Martin Luther King Jr. was at this point. Sitting 50 years later, we look back and we consider him one of the great heroes of American history, top 2 or 3 of the entire nation's lifespan. But at the time, in 1960, he was not yet a legend. You have to remember the I Have a Dream speech doesn't come until 8 years later. He was not yet a legend, but he did have some profile.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things to me in researching the book and getting to know those who were friends of King, who were in a jail cell with him, who grew up with him, and understood him as a person. And in our research, being able to take the reader into an unfamiliar place where Martin Luther King is a rising civil rights leader, but the New York Times would still have to give their reader context of he was known for a bus boycott, I'd find in like a local Atlanta paper he was having like a workshop at the local YMCA, and he had done different things that hadn't gotten many signups, so he was still finding his way, because the challenge he was in is he had the Montgomery bus boycott 4 years before the 1960 election, and which was an incredible, unexpected, inspiring success. But then he was kind of struggling to figure out, okay, now everyone is looking to me to lead a movement and to change America and to bring equality nationally, as he had, made change in one small city. And he was really struggling with how he was going to do that. And so at this critical moment in the evolution of the civil rights movement, these Black college students start doing sit-ins. They had been inspired by King's and the Montgomery bus boycott, that use of civil disobedience. They had a new spin on it, and how they were sitting down at lunch counters and going to jail. And King had never been to jail. And so King had just moved home to Atlanta. And people that grew up with him, that knew him, that he was he was kind of like an older brother figure too, that he was, a really supportive kind of mentor and ally to them, to the college students at Morehouse and Spelman and other Atlanta universities. They really, and you learn about in the first couple chapters, were putting serious pressure on him to go to jail with them. And it opened up a real agonizing choice for King for a number of reasons, but not the least of which it was an extremely dangerous thing to go into a jail in the Jim Crow South voluntarily. That was a mind-blowing thing to people. But King, the book is ultimately about, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but making that choice, staring down death as he does over the next 9 days, and the harrowing things that happen to him were critical in elevating him to be the national leader and helping him see the future course of the civil rights movement, allowing him to go on to something like Birmingham, 3 years later, which required staring down death again. What he goes through in these 9 days helped him become the leader we remember. So I think people are really enjoying reading this, in a sense, origin story of King as a leader. And there's a lot we can learn from him and the Atlanta student activists who were not famous figures. Most of them still are not famous figures, but changed America, changed the world, and changed the leader we do remember with Dr. King.
I do want to correct something I said. I said he didn't give the I Have a Dream speech 8 years later. It was actually 3 years later. My apologies. 1963. Of course, I was thinking 1968 for a much worse reason.
Yeah.
Where was the presidential race at this time? What did the electoral map look like? How did the votes of African Americans figure in? Why were both campaigns treading so carefully when it came to throwing their weight behind strong civil rights laws and other promises? And what's really interesting is the thinking at the time was that Nixon would have the edge with Black voters.
Yeah, so that's another thing that is really unfamiliar to us. And so we help ground the reader in a different world of 1960, where the Black vote is really up for grabs, and it looks like it might go 50-50 in the sense that Black voters were looking at who was going to be better for them. It wasn't clear. John Kennedy seemed like this, was this aloof Massachusetts senator, rich boy, who'd been accommodationist to Southern senators. In the 1950s, Nixon had been seen as a force for civil rights in Washington as vice president, and had befriended Martin Luther King. And the King family, they were Republicans. Daddy King was, in the days before this arrest, he's doing, Republican rallies for Nixon in Atlanta, in the Black community of Atlanta. Black Atlantans voted Republican. And so we have to understand that for Black Atlantans, the governor is a Democrat. These Dixiecrat politicians who are maintaining segregation, they are by and large Democrats. So it makes all the sense in the world that they're Republicans. But overall, I think people just were not focused in sufficiently on that there could be a power in the Black vote. Obviously, in a lot of the country, Black voters weren't able to vote, but in cities and in the North that they were. And it turns out the Black vote would be very well distributed to make a critical difference in an electoral map that is so different than ours today. Like today we have, less than 10 states that kind of decide an election. In the 1960 election, so many states were close. Like the vast majority of states were decided by a few thousand votes. So it's really a wild electoral map where kind of, New York's up for grabs, California's up for grabs, Illinois is up for grabs, Texas is up for grabs, And
do you think that's healthier? Do you think that's healthier for our country?
you know, I mean, it's yeah, in a lot of ways, in that, you know, that the politicians who are having to go everywhere, talk to all voters. Now they really, you know, focus on voters in a few states, and things were less regional in the sense of just kind of like, you know. But one thing you see in the book is the way that the South had voted Democrat for a long time, and Nixon started to think he might be able to flip these southern states to Republicans, and so that's going to be a factor in why he doesn't speak out. But he will eventually do that, and that is the politics we have today. But he's not going to be able to do it in this election for the reasons that you find out, for the power that Black voters find to choose the candidate that they trust, that shows some of his character that they believe will mean he'll push for equality. But yeah, it's a really interesting question of when we have such a narrow map, when we have such a polarized, partisan, really almost kind of tribal politics today. You know, there's a lot less openness, I think, among a lot of voters. And two of the characters in the book are Nixon's Black advisors, Jackie Robinson and E. Frederick Morrow, who are pushing him to speak out for the imprisoned king. And I mention them here to your question because they wanted Republicans to be the leaders on civil rights. And so I think they wanted a future where the two parties were really competing on civil rights, you know, who is, you know, doing more for that. And so, you know, I think that would be healthy. That was more of the dynamics today, but that is, you know, not exactly the dynamics today. The two parties have, you know, have totally different appeals to kind of turn out the two coalitions that we have.
What did each candidate have in their backgrounds that leaves clues as to how sympathetic they would be to the lives of Americans who are Black? There's one quote in the book where JFK says, "You got to excuse me here. I have very little experience with African Americans." And at the same time, you talk all about how Richard Nixon grew up in really difficult circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is really interesting to understand what Nixon did overcome in kind of his underdog background that at a young age made him, I think, more sympathetic to victims of discrimination. Now, he'll later be seduced by a politics of kind of grievance and resentment and the kind of dog whistle politics that allow you to not say things that someone will identify as racist, but is like tapping into resentments. But yeah, he you know, grew up, you know, waking up at 3:30 in the morning to go get the goods for the family store, and you know, he couldn't go to the Ivy League schools because he couldn't afford it, and got a scholarship to Duke. So he always saw himself as the overlooked underdog, you know, against these elites. And of course, John Kennedy comes from the most.
Yeah, he wasn't getting up at 3 a.m. to go take a drive to get stuff for the family store.
He certainly was not. He had no idea where the money even came from. He just never had to worry about it.
Right.
The one thing that he did have was he did have, you know, some understanding that, you know, Irish people had been discriminated against, and he did have an understanding that there's poverty in America, and that was wrong. But when King, so one of our characters, Harris Wofford, who's a civil rights advisor for Kennedy, you know, he had arranged a couple of meetings with King and Kennedy, and the thing King wanted to feel more from Kennedy was a visceral sense of this discrimination is wrong. We have to fix this. And he kind of thought, you know, Kennedy was thinking of civil rights as a bit of a problem to be managed, and wasn't really emotionally connected to it. And what's interesting is in an early draft of the book, we had a line that was essentially like, you know, just in his background, Kennedy hadn't been exposed to, you know, Black community, Black issues, and a Black friend who was kind enough to read the book before it was published said, well, you know, that's kind of letting him off the hook. Like, don't we have to seek out things beyond our experience? And I thought that was like a great flag. And so I rewrote that sentence. But you know, fundamentally, Kennedy would have to listen to perspectives that were beyond his experience. And he does do that in the 9 days, and then makes, you know, critical decisions that helped save Dr. King's life. And, so it's an interesting thing that, we can grow. There's things beyond our experiences. And Kennedy did have a decency that allowed him to do what was right in this instance.
And I think it's also worth remembering that he was sick a number of times. He was interacting with nurses and with people during World War II who certainly didn't come from the same privileged background. So even if he was somewhat sheltered racially, he still was not quite sheltered from the realities of what the world could bring, which I think is interesting. How do the campaigns initially react to the arrest of Dr. King with just 2.5 weeks to go before the election?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
King is arrested in Atlanta for the student sit-in at Rich's department store. And initially, they're not doing much. So on the Kennedy side, our characters are Louis Martin, who was a Black advisor who had come from the Chicago Defender and been recruited onto the campaign to kind of save their fledgling Black outreach, because they had been being run by two white liberals, Harris Wofford, who had been an advisor to King, and a Howard Law graduate who was passionate about Gandhi and civil disobedience, so a really interesting character, and Sergeant Shriver. And to their credit, they were really trying to run something new, which was a substantive issue-based outreach to Black voters, and that really hadn't been done in politics before. So they took Black voters seriously, but they didn't know people in the community to really to do what they needed to do organizing-wise. And so Louis Martin was able to really help them do that. So they're monitoring the situation, but essentially there was a critical difference that happened when King goes to jail in Atlanta. The Atlanta mayor was a relative kind of racial moderate. And so King is thought of as, pretty safe in there. But what happens that really changes the whole situation is the neighboring county, DeKalb, that was thought of back then as like Klan country, seizes King because of a previous traffic violation, takes him into custody, and then is going to sentence him to 4 months at the perilous state prison in rural Georgia, Reidsville. And so that's what escalates the situation, and will ultimately kind of force the issue. But Harris Wofford, the thing he does before all of that happens was he does call down to someone he knew in Atlanta to kind of see, because a couple of days had passed and he had thought, I'm Martin's friend. I'm the Kennedy Civil Rights Advisor. This is terrible. I haven't done anything. And he starts to make inquiries which get to the mayor of Atlanta. And then the mayor of Atlanta comes out and says, well, the Kennedy campaign has, gotten involved in this. And Harris is like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. I didn't clear any of this. But that is a critical moment in the story, because now the Kennedy campaign, like it or not, they're engaged, they're involved. And as the situation is going to get more dangerous, that is going to make it, really increase the need for them to solve it.
And this is why you say that this is also not only a race to win the election, but a race to save Martin Luther King's life, because the fear is that if he gets taken from this local jail, this Atlanta jail, to the state pen, that is it presents a whole different slew of dangers to an African-American leader.
Yeah, and we found a lot of accounts of people being killed in this, black men being killed in Reedsville, and so and Daddy King is told that this is going to be a way that King can be quietly killed, and King is going to be, because first he's taken to DeKalb County, and then he's woken up in the middle of the night, shackled, put in the back of the car, not told where he's going, thinking he's going to his death, driven all night across Georgia, in an experience that you learn about in the book will really change his life. So it gets a lot more dangerous, and that's going to prompt Coretta King to, call Harris crying of, they're going to kill Martin. I know they will. So it's going to get a lot more dangerous, but even still, in those first few days, I mentioned the black Republicans. And there was a black Atlanta Republican leader named John Calhoun. He's calling, the Nixon campaign and Republican leadership, saying, "Hey, you got to speak out. This is an important moment. Martin Luther King is in jail. We could, the Democrats have put him in jail. This is we got to, speak out. I know Martin is, a friend of Nixon's." And then you see over these days that Nixon just gets chance after chance to do that and keep passing.
I do want to focus on Martin Luther King's. I want to focus on that first night in jail. I want to focus on that feeling that he had in jail. And you do quote, I guess, something that he probably wrote later on in his life. He says, and I'm going to read the quote. He says, "There's something inherently depressing about jail. It leaves one caught in the dull monotony of sameness. It's like being dead while one still lives. It is life without the singing of a bird, the sight of the sun, the moon, and the stars, without fresh air. In short, it's life without the beauties of life." So talk about how he reacted to jail in the moment. This is the first time he's ever been in jail overnight. And just explain how the rest of his life is then impacted by this experience of jail.
Yeah. So the first night he's with a group of the male students, the Morehouse students, and he's in a cell with the leader, who is named Lonnie King, who, like Harris, helped us write this book before his passing, the same year that Harris passed, just a year before the book came out. And when he was with them, jail was bearable for him because Lonnie said it was like a nonviolence retreat. They were talking about movement strategy. They were, they were telling jokes. They were, King was teaching them about, different philosophies and for politics and religion. And so he liked that company. But what's going to happen is all the students are going to, in a few days, they are released and King is held. And that's where it gets bad for King because, as he goes through, he wrote more about experiences in jail later in the 60s in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, and that quote comes from later experiences, but was the best encapsulation of how that jail was like. I mean, it was like dying for him. It was anxiety that was just really hard to bear. Coretta says, I just don't think, I don't know if Martin can survive it, and that she just really worried about, like, Martin can't be alone, and so of course we know that solitary confinement, the effect it can have on people as a kind of a form of torture. So that's what King kind of goes into in these 9 days after the students are able to be released, but he is held. And that was just a very difficult thing for him that I hope gives us all a greater admiration for King and what he endured. And he didn't do these things because he liked to do them. He did them because he thought they were necessary to force us to confront these issues, to make people think about it, to shame our country and make us not be able to turn away and avoid these issues, but make us say, what's wrong? This minister is, in jail and forced to go through these things. It's wrong that the law is does not seem on the moral side of this. And so, but we wanted to kind of, using the things he did leave behind, some sermons he made at the time, and some interviews, be able to get across why that was, why it was so challenging, and give you his Reedsville experience.
Until this point, JFK is staying quiet. One of his aides, you quote, even is saying, if he would just lose his cool and show his passion, maybe he could call Coretta Scott King. How does the decision get made to eventually call her? How does it go down? And it's this very interesting kind of scene where he's sitting in a hotel room and someone just says, why don't you call? And he goes, yeah, I'll pick up. Sure. What happens?
So Harris, the King friend and Kennedy advisor, he and his partner on the campaign, Louis Martin, the black advisor, they've been kind of stymied on trying to get public statements out about it. And they just go out for a beer, and Harris is kind of talking out loud. And he's, as you said, he's just, what if it's just something more human? What if he just like calls her something more real? Who cares about press releases? And Louis jumps on that idea, and he said, that's just the thing that would really make a difference to people. And so the third member of the team, Sergeant Shriver, who's a Kennedy brother-in-law, and was in charge of constituency outreach for the campaign, was back in Chicago, and they get this idea to him the next morning, and Kennedy was getting ready to leave O'Hare after campaigning in Illinois, and Shriver gets to Kennedy's hotel room, makes sure the other advisors are out of the room who would stop this risky idea, and just poses it as this wife is really scared, and it would be the right thing to do.
And explain, just real quick, explain why that would be a risky idea. Explain that.
Yeah, because King, a young civil rights activist, is controversial, to say the least, with particularly Southern white voters. So if you are, in a sense, kind of allying yourself with him, of, expressing sympathy, that's not how a lot of white voters thought of it. They thought, oh, he broke the law, he was arrested, and good, because he's, making trouble and just going to cause nothing but problems, or even worse, even, more hostile, violent feelings towards him. And so, it might seem obvious today, but this was really, and they didn't expect one phone call to change our politics, but they did think it was the right thing to do. And by that time, because this unit had involved their campaign in it, Kennedy is already working back channels with the really unexpected people in terms of the racist democratic leadership of the state. That he's already actually working some back channels to get King out, and we tell that whole story. But
and he called Governor Vanderveer, didn't he?
Exactly.
Yeah, and that, that I'm sorry to keep sending you in different directions here, but the phone call is so fascinating to read, because I've listened to many tapes of JFK phone calls, and it's always him dominating, and it's always him hanging up at the end, and he just yells and yells until he goes, okay, goodbye. It doesn't even say goodbye. He just goes, okay. And that call with Governor Vanderveer, he's basically like, could you throw me a bone here? And he's like, whoa, I don't know if I have any bones to throw on this one.
Yeah, I mean, that would be political suicide if it's found out that this governor of Georgia, who is
a Democrat,
he's a Democrat, and his campaign was based around starving off Brown versus Board of Education, keeping segregated schools in Georgia. He is, these Southern governors are like position themselves as the bulwark against integration, and Kennedy is like, you need to do this for our party here, get this guy out, this is ridiculous. And so Vanderveer starts to work back channels that go ultimately to this judge, and so it is kind of like a thriller, kind of a bit of a spy kind of thing in those chapters of how that happens, but how it has to be silent, how there's different cover stories that happen, but it's part of the real story that is larger than what I think is, to the extent people know about this, they know Kennedy made a call, and that was really important. But there's just these other parts that make it, I think, a really kind of exciting, rich few days. But that call does end up being really important because it was human. Because and you find out later in the book, maybe we'll get there, how this team will go rogue to let black voters know about the call.
Yes, we're going to talk about the blue bombs.
We're going to talk about that. But it worked. Electorally, in politics, things of the heart and emotion, they matter, and that's.
But so explain the call. So explain the call he has with Coretta Scott King. I sent you in a few directions. It's my
Yeah.
fault as the host here, but basically they get her on the phone. He's sitting there on the phone. Please hold for Senator Kennedy, and Coretta Scott King picks up. What's the exchange?
Well, it's a very short exchange considering the impact it would have on voters as part of this realignment and giving us the world we have today of over 90% of Black voters vote Democrat. It's just a short, quick call of I understand that your husband's the president, and he knew that she was pregnant, and he just expresses his sympathy, and she thanks him for it, and it really was just a few seconds, and then he goes off and the campaign. And that's what's amazing about a close election, an election that was as close as this one is. A decision like that can have such an impact, and for all Kennedy knows, it could cost him the election. It ends up helping him win the election, but it was just one little piece of his day of going, to all these stops, meeting all these voters, doing all these things. But it will be a very consequential moment in American politics for this linkage between Democrats and the Black community of who can be trusted.
Describe the reaction that Daddy King has, because he says something that is so it's so consequential, and he basically essentially hears that JFK soothed the heart of his son's wife.
Yeah, and again, this call might seem obvious or mundane now, but as one person put it to me, I think Andrew Young said this to me, like he had just never seen something like this in politics. You just have to understand where the situation of 1916, he'd just never seen a white politician express this kind of, sympathy, like put themselves out there for, a Black person, a civil rights activist. And so for Daddy King, who had been really against Kennedy and really for Nixon, and Daddy King was less reserved than his son. He was like strong emotions. He says, if he can, wipe the tears, from my daughter-in-law's eyes, then he can have my vote. And he just immediately flips and then is going to give a sermon after King is released during a packed church night in Ebenezer, where he just goes so strongly for Kennedy, knowing that Nixon did not speak up, and that quote is going to be, amplified in Black media, in part by Louis Martin on the campaign. But for Daddy King, it just really, he was scared. He thought his beloved son was going to die, and I think if any of us are ever in a moment like that, the person who speaks out or is there for us, gets our loyalty. And that's really, how Daddy King felt about the situation. He didn't see the politics in it.
And he says, I'm going to dump all my votes in his lap.
Yeah. Which, he meant, his flock, his church, the people that follow him. But he said, I got
a bag of votes or something, or a suitcase of votes, and I'm going to dump them in his lap.
And I'm going to dump them on his lap. And so he was saying, I'm going to move Black Atlanta voters, and it would end up being more than just Atlanta ones for Kennedy. And those were powerful quotes when, again, things were, could have really gone either way.
We spend too much time in history and analyzing history and talking about JFK. What's the quote? Too much profile, not enough courage. Let's talk about the Nixon side here. What is going on the Nixon side in the Nixon campaign as these moves are being made on the Kennedy side? The argument, and you just said it, the argument on the Nixon side could have been, hey, the Democrats are the one putting this guy in jail. Describe Jackie Robinson here and what he's trying to do. He is pleading with Nixon to take a stand.
Yeah, so you kind of get to learn the story of how Jackie Robinson, the baseball legend, who really, he had a strong reaction against John Kennedy at the outset of the campaign, really thought Nixon was someone to be trusted, and he goes out, campaigning all over the country for Nixon, and really thinks Nixon is key for opportunity for Black Americans, and then this guy E. Frederick Morrow, who was the first Black White House aide in the Eisenhower White House, and Morrow, really had a vision of winning back Black voters to the Republican Party. Of course, Black voters were initially Republicans, because of Lincoln, but then the New Deal and the economic opportunity of Roosevelt, most go over to Democrats, and now it's like, but then they were kind of winning them back during the Eisenhower years, and now it's kind of like I said, kind of for they're looking for which way they're going to go. It's just not settled. And so Morrow and Robinson are just kind of like chasing Nixon through Midwest hotels and, train stops on the campaign, just trying to get in a room, get a message to Nixon. As you said, pleading with him to do it. It was so clear to them that this was, well, obviously one, that's just the right thing to do, but they were totally clear on the politics. And so Nixon had good advisors too. It's just the difference ends up being who listens to others' perspectives, as Kennedy ultimately will do that in terms of the perspective of that comes from Louis Martin and Harris Wofford. But they wanted Nixon to really seize this mantle that built on the work that he had done, because again, he had befriended King. They had exchanged these nice letters. They had met in the years previous. It's like, why'd you do all this legwork? And here's this perfect opportunity to seize it. But Nixon, we believe it was just really seduced by the possibility of stealing that Democratic South, and that meant a lot of white voters, and that meant that he did not want to upset the apple cart there. And hey, politicians all the time choose the cautious route. They're making these judgment calls of what they can do or say and not lose votes. And but ultimately Kennedy will decide to be bolder than Nixon here and speaking up for what's right.
So we've discussed the call that was made to Coretta Scott King. We've discussed the call to Governor Vandiver. How does the Kennedy campaign, I don't want to overrate their impact on this, but how does Martin Luther King eventually get out of jail? How is he eventually released? And was it Kennedy's influence, or was it that Georgia was just afraid of how this looked?
So King is in Reidsville. Kennedy is, because these aides have started this unsanctioned intervention, Kennedy is inclined to finish it, and Bobby Kennedy is tasked with getting this done, and so he will make a call to the judge. And you learn about how this all happens, because it's been told in history as this, he just got spontaneously mad about it, and he did get mad about it, but there was like a plan via these back channels for how this was all going to go down in a way that wouldn't end the political careers of the Georgians that they needed to release King. But they talked to the judge. The judge ultimately kind of does the favor for the Democratic Party. Maybe he was hoping to get a favor later, and they want to get their party in there because they think that will starve off civil rights, but that won't be what ends up happening. But they are able to get the judge to, surprisingly to people, reverse his decision. And King's lawyer, I want to also mention Donald Hollowell.
There's a really interesting cross-examination that goes on there with Hollowell, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, Hollowell is just a real American hero, and he in the hearings, which are presented in the book, as we found the transcript for the first time of King's court hearings, he really tries to put segregation on trial, and the judge doesn't want to hear it, but he argued brilliantly, and then he also finds, with his team, kind of a legal loophole that allows the judge to use that as the pretext for going ahead and getting King home. So it's my favorite scene of the book is, how when Hollowell gets to Reedsville, how they get King on a little plane and bring him back home to Atlanta, and the students are waiting for him. And I just love those pages. I think people have to read those, and so they get him back, but from there, the Kennedy civil rights team feels that maybe people haven't focused enough in the Black community on what Kennedy did.
So let me get to that in one. Let me get to that in 1 second.
Yeah.
But the question I want to ask first is:
Yeah.
King doesn't endorse, but when he's asked by reporters, he does thank JFK, and ultimately he believes this is a genuine move that went beyond political expediency. Do you agree that JFK's team truly meant this?
I think they held two thoughts in their mind. I think it wasn't one or the other, and the reader can make their own decisions, or their own interpretation. But I think it was both. I mean, particularly for the civil rights team, they just first and foremost wanted to save King's life, and King was a cherished friend of Harris Wofford, and Louis Martin, revered King, and so they held that in their minds first. But they also thought there was some really useful politics here to win the Black vote. And the way Louis Martin put it, in his unpublished recollections that I used for the book, that it was also about he just thought his candidate had done a good thing and people should know about it. It genuinely moved him, and he thought, this deserves to be known and understood. And so for Kennedy, I mean, I do think he would have just as well not engaged on this at all, but they had gotten him involved, and the Kennedys, I think they didn't like just gestures. They didn't like just virtuous gestures. They were inclined at that point, all right, let's get the guy home. Let's solve this. It is the right thing to do. It's BS. Over a traffic charge, they're putting a minister in jail for 4 months. So I think that they because King essentially says, that they didn't know how the politics of this would go. So this was just this. He did feel that, and this is what he says when he comes out of the jail, that it was Kennedy's humanitarian sense that made him do it. And so King, heading into this election and then even after this, he does not want to be co-opted by either political party. He knows there would be a benefit to either of these campaigns in having his association, and he wants to have a moral stature that goes beyond partisan politics. So he ends up deciding not to endorse, but what he's already said is good enough. It is all that the Kennedy campaign civil rights team needs to really drive home the association that they had wanted to create between this rising civil rights leader and their candidate.
I hope I'm not messing up the term here, but there's a wonderful term in the book called blue bombs.
Yes.
How does JFK and the JFK campaign try to amplify what was done to get Martin Luther King out of jail?
Yeah, so it's just one of the great schemes, I think, in American political history, and for you as a journalist to, I think, appreciate Louis Martin, who was a journalist, who was an editor, his understanding of how to tell a story. And so Louis, a few days after all this, is just thinking, I don't know if people have really focused in on this.
And let's be clear, this is only a few days before. This is only a week before the election or so. This is not a month. This is a week before.
Exactly. So time is precious. You only have a couple decisions left. But even though Bobby had helped get King home, he was so mad that this team had gotten them involved in a explosive situation that he tells them, you're to do nothing further on the campaign. You're done. And then they decide, you know what? We're going to print millions of pamphlets and distribute it through Black communities of exactly what happened. And so, because Louis has this idea that Harris encourages, they call up Shriver, and he's like, we're not going to tell my brothers-in-law about it. Let's just do it. If it helps win the election, they'll be happy we did it. And I'll get you the money for it. And so they, again, because Louis has this background as a journalist, he's able to lay it out tell the story in a quick pamphlet. It was on blue paper, so that's why it was called the Blue Bomb. And then using his networks in every large Black community or Black community of a lot of different sizes in the country, they get it distributed. So it's distributed in church when people are coming out of church, in Chicago, in New York. They're handing it out through communities, because the genius of it was Louis' understanding that white media was just different, and then Black media, they weren't focused in on things happening in the Black community, and so this could be kind of under the nose of white voters, not to mention their own campaign.
Yeah, it's not like today.
He wanted to get.
It's not like today where like a tweet would go out and everybody in America would see it within 5 minutes. There were two totally different media ecosystems.
So true. Yeah, exactly. And he's both talking to editors of Black papers in different cities and pushing the story that way. And then also just the good old fashioned organizing of, people that are the precinct leader, the Black leader, get this thing out. This is the dynamic piece of kind of lit that we want distributed. And so for a lot of Black voters who were, struggling to kind of differentiate these two candidates who had not prioritized some issues that were important to them. They're both just kind of these, young candidates that, that this was able to be a critical thing. And again, the Kennedy Civil Rights Team had been doing some really substantive civil rights outreach, and so this was able to be a nice, a cherry on the cake. But it was credible in the sense that they had done different things along the way that really showed their interest in civil rights. And then this was a very human, understandable
it was tangible
way exactly. And so and then in the pamphlet it contrasts with Nixon staying silent, so they were really trying to kind of drive the knife in there of that, painting him as rightfully kind of as cowardly. So they figure out this distribution in a few days, and in the precious time they have left in the campaign. And that is a story that I think it's also about the friendship of these three advisors. And I think it's an exhilarating thing, when you have a good idea, an important idea, and when you make it happen, and how they did that, and the role that plays in changing our country's history and our politics, I think is amazing.
What happens on election day? A, did Black votes make a difference? And B, did the release of Martin Luther King make a difference in who they vote for?
Yeah, well, the thing about a razor close election across a lot of states is everything makes a difference. And this certainly did. And Black voters account for the difference in at least 9 states in the way that they moved from the previous election to the Democratic Party. The Republicans have been gaining. And then in this election, Democrats reverse it, win about 66%. Republicans would never do even close to that well again. 4 years later, as once Kennedy pursues civil rights, and then Johnson really does, then it looks like it does today with 95%, 94%, 90%, going Democrat. So, but the thing is, again, with these states, so a few thousand Black voters moving ends up being really consequential in these very close states, in places like Illinois and North Carolina and Delaware and New York and these states where if you can move some voters, then that's going to be the difference. So and again, that there's a lot of kind of testimony from the time of how it impressed people when they learned about what Kennedy did. And so that there was a real kind of electricity to this story in the Black community. And so there you have them choosing the president that they want, and that they're going to hold to account to now advance civil rights, which ends up being a whole another struggle and challenge, but and one that is not unlike the situation we have today in a new president, but the nation will soon wake up to the power that Black voters have that had not been focused on before, but they made their voice heard.
There's one argument in the book that I think is worth asking about. It's a quote from somebody who's basically asking, is it patronizing to suggest that one phone call can make a difference? Is that belittling the judgment that voters have? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's why I think that we really took kind of great pains to show how it was part of this larger substantive outreach that Louis Martin and Harris Wofford had kind of created with Sergeant Shriver, that it wasn't just this thing. But we do think that, or Louis did think it really helped as a clincher for it, and really, for voters who were, that became maybe more open to Kennedy than they thought they were going to be, then this kind of solidified. And I think, so we included that quote because we wanted to allow that perspective of, okay, is that patronage? And so I think that's a reasonable thing to think about. But I also would say that politics is like this sometimes. Elections can be, and our perception of politicians can be determined by really little things. And I think that's just true of voters in general, just how our minds work of, what's revealed about someone, what is shown in their character. And I think, there's a lot of examples of that. And the improvisation nature of the way this election ended, in that, none of this was ordained, that people made fast choices, and that changes history. But that's an exciting thing, because it was a test of people, and they did make certain determinations that would end up shaping their legacy. And we think it's really important for, again, understanding our politics today, to understand kind of this moment, and the way activists shaped it, and forcing the issue, forcing in a sense a test of these candidates. I just think the emotion and human senses of the decency remains a big part of politics.
As you said earlier, this is the last election fought in every region of the country. One of the things that sticks out to me is the way our politics looks right now, where the Deep South and the Upper South vote generally in one way, at least in presidential elections. We all know the quotes that Richard Nixon and his team said during the 1968 election. Does this moment start the slide to the Southern strategy that becomes a touchstone of American politics for the next 2, maybe even 3 generations? And why did Nixon go from being, maybe sensible is the word, why did he go from being so sensible to being so harsh on race?
Yeah, it is ultimately unknowable, but in that, on recorded tapes in the White House, he said just terribly racist stuff, and it raises the question, was that always him, and he was like putting on this good front earlier, or did he kind of like harden in a certain bitterness? And it's probably some of both, because one insight into his emotions after the election is that were in his files in the Nixon library, is someone sent him a note of, do you think it might be good politics to send a note back to all these people that telegrammed you asking you to speak up to for King, and he just scrolled on this no. And I think he was really hurt by Black voters, in my view, justifiably evading him. But I think this was a painful thing. He did an interview with Jet, was it Ebony, a few years on, where he's just rehashing this from different angles and just saying, it's just not fair. You're not supposed to call a judge. That was grandstanding. I was, trying to do things behind the scenes. He just created all these justifications. I didn't know one phone call could, change all these things.
He felt slighted.
Yeah, exactly. And it's I can't imagine running for president. I mean, you take everything personally, I'm sure.
Right.
But he wasn't seeing that he, could have done a braver thing. And so, but I do think ultimately Nixon wanted, power, and he, wanted to be the one shaping the world. And he did see an opportunity with Southern voters, and the Southern strategy was not, it was just kind of like just beginning to team a little in his brain, I think, in this election when he went down to Georgia in August and saw a big rally. And I wonder if that was kind of part of the beginning of it. But he will really develop a language over, ultimately for 68 and 72, that really activated certain resentments against the progress of the civil rights movement. And so he's going to, talk about things like busing and crime and welfare and different things that will have a lot of white voters going for him, and then on the other side, when LBJ is signing civil rights legislation and King is beside him, he says, well, we've lost to the South for a generation. And so the Democratic Party was making a different set of decisions around leading on civil rights. But there's going to be a reaction against that. And Nixon was there to really capitalize that, but take it from the George Wallace explicit language and find a subtler language for the reactions against it. But what's fascinating is, after we had finished this book, Georgia, and electing to the Senate the minister of King's Church, after a lot of years of organizing, for change there. So, none of these things are inevitable, and there is change in politics, and our coalitions can change. But it is certainly amazing to look back at like what the world looked like in 1960 and how these states were, and then, and look at, how it is today.
The worst thing about being an author is that people then ask you to rewrite history and ask questions like, well, what if this had happened? So my question is to you is, what if it had been Nixon who had called Martin Luther King?
I think he would have won the election. Again, that's totally unprovable. Yeah. But I think if he, if none of this had happened, maybe he was going to win, say 45% of the black vote, maybe between 40 and 45. I think if he gets over 50%, if he's able to shift enough through, speaking out, then I do think he wins the election. And we're in a very different world where, maybe Republicans, are, seen by black voters as the leaders on civil rights. But that is unprovable. And maybe he then loses white voters and doesn't win because Johnson was able to, I think, be helping Kennedy hold on to a place like Texas, and the subtleties to which their team did this, really, I just don't think they lost a lot of white votes over that. They were scared they were going to. There was definitely a risk of it. There were a lot of white politicians that were furious about it in the South, but they were able to kind of, voters just didn't kind of moved on, didn't pay too much attention. So, I think had Nixon done the politically courageous thing, I think it would have paid off politically, but we'll never know. But that's what happened to Kennedy.
Dare I ask, you've written about interracial collaboration. That's your focus between you and your father. And by the way, thanks to him for writing the book. We're sorry he can't be with us here today, but you, I guess, handle the interviews, which is fine. Dare I ask, what is going to be next for you, if there is a next book? Is there a collaboration you see going on today that you think needs a book?
Yeah, we're not sure yet, but one thing we would love to write about is Lafayette Square and the clash that happened during this past campaign, because we think that was just an important inflection point in the campaign, but really in American life, of the two forces that met there between the interracial Black Lives Matter protests and Trump's forces. And so that's something we'd love to write about. I'm not sure if we'll see. But as you said, this theme is very interesting to us. We want to find examples in history that we can draw on today and learn from for effective work across racial lines in America. And so writing about the previous one, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and the one before that about a civil rights case in Boston before the Civil War for equal desegregated schools with a black lawyer and a white lawyer, Charles Sumner and Robert Morris. Harris was that story. And so Harris and Louis are a great team in this book that I think that we can learn from. And so it's certainly a central question of American life that we want to keep exploring and giving people perspectives that we can learn from history, and that we can draw on in our own daily lives, and the things that we might do that might be uncomfortable, that might in some ways feel real risky, but are right for how we move past inequalities to really live up to the ideals that we have and what we want to see and be lived by everyone in America.
Paul Kendrick, co-author of 9 Days, The Race to Save Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life and Win the 1960 Election. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Certainly check out that book and also his website, paulkendrick.com. He's on Twitter at paulkendrick84. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History, and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.